The bunkers didn't fall easy. We burned them out. One by one, concrete tomb by concrete tomb, with streams of liquid fire that turned the inside of those Japanese strongholds into furnaces hot enough to melt steel. I was 22 years old, Corporal Jimmy Sullivan from Boston, Massachusetts, and I carried an M2 flamethrower on my back like some kind of fire-breathing dragon. The thing weighed 70 pounds when full, but after 3 days of fighting on Kwajalein Atoll, it felt light as a feather. Maybe that was the adrenaline, maybe that was the fury. Or maybe I'd just gotten used to being death himself, walking across the coral sands of the Marshall Islands in February 1944. The morning of February 1st started with the biggest naval bombardment I'd ever seen in my life. Our battleships and cruisers had been pounding Kwajalein Island for 3 straight days, turning what used to be a tropical paradise into something that looked like the surface of the moon. From our landing craft, bobbing in the lagoon at dawn, I could see palm trees stripped bare, their trunks snapped like matchsticks. The entire island was smoking, a gray haze hanging over everything like fog on a cold Boston morning, whispered Private Danny Rodriguez, my demolitions partner. He was 19, a kid from Los Angeles who joined the Marines right after Pearl Harbor. There ain't gonna be nothing left to fight. I adjusted the straps of my flamethrower and checked my .45 pistol one more time. Don't count on it, Rodriguez. Those Japs dig deep. Our squad leader, Sergeant Mike O'Brien, a tough Irish kid from Chicago who'd already seen action on Guadalcanal, stood up in the landing craft as we approached the beach. Listen up, Marines. Intelligence says there's about 8,000 enemy troops on this rock. Most of them are holed up in concrete bunkers and underground tunnels. The Navy's been working them over, but don't expect this to be a cakewalk. We're gonna hit Red Beach 2 in exactly 15 minutes. Flamethrower teams, you're gonna be busy today. Felft, landing vehicle track, churned through the shallow water of the lagoon. Around us, dozens of other amphibious vehicles carried the men of the 7th Infantry Division and the 4th Marine Division toward the beaches of Kwajalein. This was Operation Flintlock, the first major American offensive in the Central Pacific, and we were about to show the Japanese what real American firepower looked like. As we got closer to shore, I could see the beach through the smoke. It was covered in concrete rubble and twisted metal from the naval bombardment. Craters big enough to hide a truck dotted the sand. But beyond the beach, I could make out the dark shapes of bunkers and pillboxes, their thick concrete walls still intact despite 3 days of shelling. 30 seconds, O'Brien yelled. I said a quick prayer to St. Barbara, the patron saint of artillerymen and demolitions experts. My grandmother back in South Boston had taught me that one before I shipped out. Then the front ramp of our LVT dropped down, and we were charging across the coral sand of Kwajalein Island. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Cordite and smoke from the bombardment mixed with something else, something sweet and terrible that I didn't want to think about too hard. The second thing was the heat. Not just the tropical heat of the Marshall Islands, but the radiant heat coming off the concrete and metal that had been baking under shell fire for 3 days. We made it about 50 yards inland before the first Japanese position opened up a machine gun nest that had somehow survived the bombardment started chattering away at us from a concrete emplacement near what used to be a radio station. The bullets kicked up coral dust all around us as we dove for cover behind a shell crater. Sullivan, Rodriguez, take out that machine gun, O'Brien shouted over the gunfire. This was what we'd trained for. Rodriguez pulled out a satchel charge, 20 pounds of Composition C explosive wrapped in canvas. Willet got my flamethrower ready. The plan was simple. I'd spray the firing slit with napalm to keep the Japanese gunners' heads down, then Rodriguez would run up and plant his explosive charge. I took a deep breath and jumped up from behind the crater. The M2 flamethrower had a range of about 40 yards, and that machine gun nest was right at the edge of my effective distance. I squeezed the trigger and watched a stream of flaming napalm arc through the air toward the concrete emplacement. The jellied gasoline splashed against the walls and poured through the firing slit like liquid death. The machine gun stopped firing immediately. I could hear screaming from inside the bunker, high-pitched and desperate. It was a sound that would stay with me for the rest of my life. Rodriguez was already running, his satchel charge in hand. He made it to the bunker and slapped the explosive against the concrete wall, then came sprinting back toward our crater. The fuse was set for 10 seconds. "Fire in the hole," he yelled as he dove back down beside me. The explosion shook the ground underneath us. When the smoke cleared, there was a gaping hole in the side of the machine gun nest. Nothing was moving inside. "Good work, boys," O'Brien said, patting us both on the back. "But we got about 100 more of those to deal with." He wasn't exaggerating. As our company advanced inland, we discovered that the Japanese had turned Kwajalein into a fortress. Every 50 yards or so, there was another concrete bunker or pillbox, each one carefully positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. The 3-day naval bombardment had destroyed most of the above-ground structures, but these underground positions were still very much in business. The Japanese defenders weren't the same enemy we'd faced in the early days of the war. These weren't the elite troops who'd conquered Singapore and the Philippines. Most of them were labor troops and construction workers who'd been building airfields and fortifications throughout the Marshall Islands. But they were still Japanese, and they were still willing to fight to the death rather than surrender. Our next target was a complex of bunkers near the island's airstrip. Intelligence had told us this was probably the command center for the entire Japanese garrison. As we approached the position, I could see why the Navy's bombardment hadn't been able to knock it out. The bunkers were built into a coral ridge with walls that looked like they were 6 feet thick. The entrances were protected by steel doors, and the whole complex was connected by underground tunnels. "This is gonna be a tough nut to crack," Rodriguez said, checking his remaining satchel charges. He had 4 left. "We'll crack it," I replied, adjusting the fuel tanks on my flamethrower. I had enough napalm for maybe 6 more good bursts. Our assault on the command bunker started just after noon. The temperature was over 90 degrees, and the humidity made it feel like we were fighting in a steam bath. The concrete and coral absorbed heat from the sun and threw it back at us like a furnace. Inside my flamethrower gear, I was soaking wet with sweat. Sergeant O'Brien coordinated the attack with Lieutenant Patterson, our platoon commander. While riflemen provided covering fire, Rodriguez and I would work our way from bunker to bunker, burning out the defenders and blowing the entrances. The first bunker in the complex had a firing port that faced toward the beach. I could see the muzzle of a machine gun poking through the narrow slit. Rodriguez and I crawled forward until we were about 20 yards away, using shell craters and piles of rubble for cover. "You ready?" I whispered. Rodriguez nodded and pulled the pin on a hand grenade. "On 3. 1, 2, 3. He threw the grenade toward the bunker entrance while I stood up and aimed me flamethrower at the firing port. The grenade exploded just as I squeezed the trigger, sending a stream of flaming napalm through the gun slit and into the bunker beyond. The machine gun fell silent, but almost immediately I could hear voices shouting in Japanese from inside the bunker. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold, the distinctive sound of a Japanese hand grenade being prepared. They were going to try to throw grenades out at us. "Rodriguez, get down," I yelled, but he was already moving, a satchel charge in his hands. The Japanese grenade came flying out of the bunker entrance just as Rodriguez reached the concrete wall. He slapped his explosive charge against the steel door and started running back toward our cover. The grenade exploded about 10 feet behind him, and I saw him stumble and fall. "Danny," I shouted, but he was already getting back up, blood running down his left arm from shrapnel wounds. "I'm okay." 10 seconds on the fuse. We both dove behind a pile of concrete rubble just as Rodriguez's satchel charge detonated. The explosion was enormous, much bigger than the 20 pounds of C4 should have made. Later, we figured out that the blast had set off some Japanese ammunition stored inside the bunker. When the smoke cleared, the entire front wall of the bunker had collapsed. But we could still hear voices from inside, Japanese soldiers calling to each other through the underground tunnels that connected the different parts of the complex. "They're still alive in there," Rodriguez said, wrapping a field dressing around his wounded arm. "Not for long," I replied. What came next was the grimmest work of my entire war. Rodriguez and I spent the next 3 hours systematically clearing every bunker in that complex. We'd approach each position carefully, watching for any signs of movement. Then I'd spray napalm through every opening I could find while Rodriguez prepared his explosive charges. Some bunkers had steel doors that we had to blow off their hinges. Others had firing ports that we had to widen with explosives before I could get my flamethrower close enough to be effective. The Japanese defenders fought with desperate courage. Even when their positions were hopeless, even when they were trapped in burning concrete tombs with no chance of escape, they kept fighting. I saw Japanese soldiers stumble out of burning bunkers, their clothes on fire, still trying to throw grenades at us with their dying breaths. In one bunker, we found evidence of what the Japanese had been planning if we'd invaded earlier. The concrete rooms were stacked with artillery shells, machine gun ammunition, and enough rice and canned fish to feed a garrison for months. Maps on the walls showed defensive positions all across the Marshall Islands. This hadn't just been a random outpost. It had been the key to Japan's entire defensive strategy in the Central Pacific. By late afternoon, Rodriguez and I had knocked out 17 bunkers in the command complex. My flamethrower tanks were nearly empty, and Rodriguez was down to his last satchel charge. But we'd done our job. The entire Japanese command structure on Kwajalein had been wiped out. As we regrouped with the rest of our company, Lieutenant Patterson gave us the word on how the battle was going. "Boys, we've got them on the run. The 7th Infantry has taken the southern half of the island, and we've secured the airstrip. Intelligence estimates there were about 8,000 Japanese troops on Kwajalein when we landed this morning. As of right now, we've counted over 6,000 confirmed dead. 6,000 dead in one day. It was hard to wrap my mind around numbers like that. In just 12 hours, American forces had killed more Japanese soldiers than had died in some entire campaigns earlier in the war. This wasn't like the bloody slugfests on Guadalcanal or Tarawa, where we'd had to fight for every yard. This was something new, a coordinated blitzkrieg that combined massive naval bombardment with rapid ground assault. But the day wasn't over yet. As the sun started to set over the Marshall Islands, we got word that there was still organized resistance in the northern part of the island. A group of Japanese defenders had holed up in a concrete communications bunker that had somehow survived 3 days of naval shelling. They had mortars and were using them to harass our advancing troops. Sullivan, Rodriguez, "You're up again," Sergeant O'Brien said. "I know you're both beat, but we need that position taken out before dark." I looked at Rodriguez. His left arm was wrapped in bloody bandages, and he looked as tired as I felt. But he just nodded and picked up a fresh satchel charge from our resupply. "Let's go finish this thing," he said. The communications bunker was the toughest nut we'd had to crack all day. It was built on high ground in the center of the island, with thick concrete walls and a steel roof that was covered with several feet of coral sand. The Japanese had dug firing positions all around it, and they had at least 2 mortars inside that they were using to drop shells on our advancing troops. Our approach to the bunker took over an hour. We had to crawl through shell craters and around piles of rubble, always watching for snipers and mortar fire. The Japanese defenders knew we were coming, and they were ready for us. When we got within 30 yards of the position, all hell broke loose. Machine gun fire erupted from 3 different firing ports, and mortar shells started dropping all around us. I rolled into a shell crater and tried to get my bearings. "Rodriguez." "You okay?" I shouted. "Yeah, I'm here," he called back from another crater about 10 yards away. "But I don't think we can get close enough with this much fire coming at us." That's when I made a decision that probably saved both our lives. Instead of trying to assault the bunker directly, I decided to use the underground tunnel system that connected all the Japanese positions. Earlier in the day, when we'd been clearing the command complex, I'd noticed that most of the bunkers were connected by these tunnels. If I could find an entrance to the tunnel system, maybe I could get underneath the communications bunker and attack it from below. "Rodriguez." "I've got an idea," I yelled over the machine gun fire. "Cover me." Rodriguez started throwing grenades toward the Japanese firing positions while I crawled back to one of the bunkers we destroyed earlier in the day. The entrance was blown open, and I could see a dark tunnel leading deeper into the coral ridge. I grabbed a flashlight from my gear and started crawling into the tunnel. It was barely wide enough for a man, and the air inside was thick with smoke and the smell of death. But it led in the right direction, toward the communications bunker. The tunnel system was more extensive than I'd realized. There were branching passages that led to different bunkers, supply rooms carved out of the coral, and even what looked like a small underground hospital. Japanese engineers had spent months building this fortress, and they'd done a thorough job. I crawled through the tunnels for what felt like hours but was probably only about 20 minutes. Finally, I came to a junction where I could hear voices speaking Japanese directly above my head. I'd found the communications bunker. There was a ladder leading up to a trapdoor in the tunnel ceiling. Very carefully, I climbed up and listened at the door. I could hear at least 4 or 5 Japanese voices and the sound of radio equipment crackling. This was definitely the command center. I climbed back down the ladder and got my flamethrower ready. The plan was simple. I'd blast open the trapdoor with napalm, then climb up into the bunker and finish off anyone who was still alive. I aimed my flamethrower at the trapdoor and squeezed the trigger. Flaming napalm sprayed across the ceiling of the tunnel and poured through the cracks around the door. Almost immediately, I could hear screaming from above. The trapdoor burst open and burning Japanese soldiers started dropping down into the tunnel. I had to scramble backward to avoid being crushed by falling bodies. The smell of burning flesh filled the narrow space, making it hard to breathe. When the screaming stopped, I climbed back up the ladder and emerged into the communications bunker. The entire interior was on fire, and thick black smoke made it almost impossible to see. Radio equipment was melting into twisted metal sculptures. Maps and documents were burning on the walls. But in one corner of the bunker, I could see movement. A Japanese officer was trying to destroy what looked like code books and radio frequencies. He was badly burned, his uniform smoldering, but he was still trying to complete his mission. I drew my .45 pistol and aimed it at him. "Stop," I yelled in English, not that I expected him to understand. The Japanese officer looked up at me. His face was horribly burned, but his eyes were still clear and determined. Instead of surrendering, he reached for his samurai sword. I shot him twice in the chest. He fell backward into the flames, and that was the end of organized Japanese resistance on Kwajalein Island. When I emerged from the bunker, the sun was setting over the Marshall Islands. The battle was over. In just one day, February 1st, 1944, American forces had destroyed an entire Japanese garrison of 8,000 men. Our casualties had been remarkably light, fewer than 200 killed and wounded across both the 7th Infantry Division and the 4th Marine Division. Rodriguez was waiting for me outside the bunker, his wounded arm in a sling but a big grin on his face. "Sullivan, I thought you were dead. What happened in there?" I told him about the tunnels and the communications bunker while we walked back toward the beach where our unit was regrouping. All around us, the island was littered with the debris of battle. Destroyed Japanese equipment, blown-up bunkers, and the bodies of enemy soldiers who had chosen death over surrender. 8,000 of them, Rodriguez said, shaking his head. "In one day." "Yeah," I replied, "and we're just getting started." Rodriguez was right. Kwajalein had been a preview of what was coming for the Japanese Empire. The lessons we'd learned here, the combination of massive naval bombardment followed by rapid assault with specialized equipment like flamethrowers and demolitions, would be used again and again as American forces advanced across the Pacific. At Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, we'd perfect this new style of warfare. But that night, as I sat on the beach cleaning my flamethrower and watching the stars come out over the Marshall Islands, I wasn't thinking about future battles. I was thinking about the Japanese soldiers we'd fought that day. They'd been brave men, fighting for their country just like we were fighting for ours. The fact that they died by the thousands while we'd barely taken any casualties didn't make them cowards or weaklings. It just meant that American industrial might and military technology had reached the point where we could overwhelm any defense the Japanese could build. The bunkers hadn't fallen easy, but they had fallen. And with them, Japan's defensive perimeter in the Central Pacific had been shattered forever. From Kwajalein, American forces would leapfrog from island to island, always getting closer to Japan itself. The road to Tokyo had been paved with the coral sand and concrete of the Marshall Islands. 3 days later, when the transports arrived to take us back to Pearl Harbor, I stood on the deck of our LST and looked back at Kwajalein Island one last time. The palm trees were starting to grow back already, green shoots pushing up through the bombed-out coral. Nature was reclaiming the island, covering over the scars of battle. But I knew I'd never forget what had happened there. The smell of napalm and burning concrete. The sound of Rodriguez's satchel charges exploding against bunker walls. The faces of Japanese soldiers who'd chosen to fight to the death rather than surrender. And most of all, the terrible efficiency with which American forces had destroyed an entire enemy garrison in just one day. We'd proven something important at Kwajalein. We'd shown that American military might, when properly coordinated and supplied, was unstoppable. The Japanese had built what they thought was an impregnable fortress in the Marshall Islands, and we'd swept it away like sand castles at high tide. But victory had come at a cost that went beyond the casualty figures. Every man who'd fought on Kwajalein had been changed by the experience. We'd seen what modern warfare could do when it was unleashed without restraint. We'd participated in the systematic destruction of thousands of human beings. And even though they'd been our enemies, even though they'd have done the same to us if they could, it left marks on our souls that would never fully heal. As our ship sailed away from the Marshall Islands, heading back toward Hawaii and eventually home, I made a promise to myself. I'd tell the story of what happened at Kwajalein, not to glorify war, but to make sure people understood what it really cost to defeat an enemy who would never surrender. The bunkers hadn't fallen easy, and neither had the men who defended them. But they had fallen, and with them, the Japanese Empire had taken another step toward its final defeat. In the coral atolls of the Marshall Islands, American forces had written the first chapter of what would become known as the Island Hopping Campaign, the series of amphibious assaults that would carry us all the way to the beaches of Japan itself. The flamethrower on my back had grown light that day, but the memory of what we'd done would stay heavy in my heart for the rest of my life. That was the price of victory in the Pacific War, and it was a price that every American who fought there would carry forever.